Hi everyone, welcome to our presentation on cannabis and psychosis. Today I'm Elias, I'm the peer support worker at Cleghorn, and underneath me we have Brian, who's the manager, and up above me is David, who's the addiction specialist. So just to get us started off is an outline of what we're going to be talking about today. So I'm going to share a brief part of my story, the lived experience with cannabis and psychosis piece, uh, and then we're going to go into some facts around cannabis and psychosis, approaches to support people with cannabis and psychosis issues, and then I'm going to end this off with the ending part of my story. So, a little bit about myself. As a peer support worker, I have my own lived experience of working through cannabis use and psychosis. So, my story starts off in a relatively good place, and it's before any of this kind of happened, and I had lots of social supports, and I was engaging in a lot of activities that would be considered protective factors. But as I started to enter into a bit more heavy cannabis use, and I started to experiment a bit more, those social supports and protective factors eventually started to fade away. An example of that is I used to be really into sports, but as soon as cannabis started to play a larger role in my life, I started to abandon that. My relationships with the people around me started to become less important because I prioritized cannabis use. And things like school and even just everyday activities started to lose their sheen. And I started to just turn to cannabis for every sort of emotion and reaction I had in my life. And naturally, this led to feelings of isolation and feeling lonely and depression. And all of this sort of ramped up into experiences that I couldn't quite explain. So at first, they would happen kind of gradually. So I'd have like a thought pop into my head, like, oh, like maybe I'm on the Truman Show. But then when I sobered up, like that would go away. I'd have experiences of like paranoia or just like extreme fear related to like people watching me or being followed and stuff like that, but I brush it off. But eventually, the psychosis started to develop a bit more, and I started to have really intense, uh, really intense emotions that would fluctuate really rapidly. I'd have a voice in my head telling me to do things. I'd start to have things called delusions of reference. For example, seeing a police car and thinking that uh, people were after me. And in all of the haze, I ended up quitting pot, but the psychosis stayed longer. Um, and eventually, all these feelings led me to feel suicidal, and I ended up in the hospital. Um, and so there is a hopeful end to this story, but I'll pass it off to Brian to get us started with the facts.
So thanks, Elias. So just really quickly, give a quick um, overview of what psychosis actually is, because I think there's sometimes some misperceptions about it. And psychosis is a medical condition, and psychosis is considered a symptom, but not necessarily a diagnosis. So somebody can have sometimes when people think psychosis, they immediately think it might be schizophrenia, but schizophrenia, or sorry, psychosis is a symptom of schizophrenia. It's not necessarily the same thing, just the way a cough might be a symptom of a flu. Um, so what somebody might see, we kind of like to break down the symptoms of psychosis into three categories. One are the positive symptoms, which are often the things that people think about when they think about psychosis. So those are something that is essentially added to somebody's cognition. So things, a common symptom might be hallucinations, so maybe seeing or hearing things that don't actually exist. Delusions are false beliefs, so perhaps believing that you may be being followed or that you have a grand purpose or something like that. And often kind of disorganized thoughts and speech can be one of the things too that people often talk about their brain kind of feeling scattered kind of thing. Another symptom of psychosis are what we call the negative symptoms. So those are the things that are a little bit harder to see, or people don't often associate with it. So that might be feelings of apathy. So just not being motivated, not wanting to do things. So people might not want to socialize or kind of participate in things like sports or whatever that they were into. You may see somebody who has what we call kind of a flat affect, so somebody who doesn't have, isn't as kind of animated as they normally are, and different rates and changes in their speech and so on. And then the third part of this is there are often a whole series of cognitive symptoms that people might experience if they're having psychosis. So those can be, difficulty paying attention to things. Those can be either they call kind of thought blocking, or kind of feeling like people's thoughts are a lot slower, or on the other side, it can feel like people's thoughts are racing. There can be struggles with kind of memory and planning and organization. So it's no one set of symptoms is the same for every single person, but it's often kind of a peppering of a lot of these things. Psychosis is probably a lot more common than you think. About 3 in every 100 people will experience psychosis in their lives, and that's about as common as type 2 diabetes. And it does kind of affect different populations similarly. So there's not one type of person or anything that will be more likely to develop psychosis. So it's something that spreads among us all. Generally speaking, it happens a little bit younger, or it happens for the first time, usually in the late teens and early 20s for people. So the kind of hotspot ages, the first episode tends to happen a little bit earlier for males. So that's usually 17 to 21 are the hotspot ages for males, and then a little bit later for females. So usually 21 to 25 are the kind of hotspot ages. And there really isn't any, we often get asked, there isn't really any sort of one cause for somebody developing psychosis, but there are a series of kind of risk factors that can make people more likely to develop a psychotic illness. So those can be environmental influences, things like being experienced or exposed to a lot of trauma and stress as a younger in your development, genetics. So there is a higher risk if you have somebody who has a mental illness in your family. That can, not necessarily, it's not causative, but there is a higher risk there. Sometimes physical illness or injuries can cause psychosis, and substance use can be a factor in that, to kind of maybe often we talk about kind of maybe one of those things for somebody who's at a high risk of developing psychosis, like pouring gasoline on a simmering fire kind of thing. So we talk about there's a lot of bad puns peppered throughout this presentation. But when we talk about cannabis, this is something that we know for sure that with a lot of our population, a lot of the people we work with, so just to go back, we're the Cleghorn Early Intervention Clinic, so we work with young people who are experiencing their first episode of psychosis. And cannabis is a factor, and a lot of our guys, I don't know the exact number offhand, but the majority of our people smoke cannabis, and it is a huge risk factor in terms of people being either their symptoms worsening or really impeding their recovery. So we just like to give a little bit more information so people can make informed decisions. So when we talk about cannabis, it's something that people have been using for a very long time. So it's nothing new to our culture. The one on the left is a cough remedy that had all sorts of things in it, alcohol and chloroform and cannabis in it, and we think often, cannabis, hippies smoking pot at Woodstock and so on, but it's really evolved a lot. This really isn't your grandma's pot anymore. There's tons of different ways to do it, from edibles to suppositories to smoking to vaping to eating it. Like it's all over the map, and it's such a part of our culture, and it's evolving so quickly that we're really trying to tease out exactly what's going on, and the kind of pace of use is kind of outpacing what we're learning about it. So we're trying to catch up in terms of the evidence with it, but there's still a lot to know. So we're just hoping to kind of shed a little bit of light on that. So to give a sense about how we're doing in Canada, we actually have probably the highest rate of youth cannabis use in the developed world. And that includes countries like the Netherlands that have had legal cannabis for some time, but we do have some of the highest, if not the highest, youth rate in the world of cannabis use. Now, to add to that is that cannabis really isn't the pot that our parents might have smoked at Woodstock. The level of THC has increased very significantly. And that little graph that you see at the bottom is actually pulled from a paper that just shows over the last few decades just how much the concentration of THC is. So when you're looking at kind of the naturally occurring cannabis that you might see, growing randomly in a field somewhere, the THC content is up to about 30 times higher than what you would see just a naturally occurring pot that would have been smoked commonly a couple of generations ago. And then when you look at some of the concentrates like shatter, like the THC content is three or four times more of that, so it can be up to 80% THC content. So it isn't the same thing as it used to be. Some of the things we often hear, and just we're going to talk a little bit about some of the myths, is that cannabis is good for you, that it's medically proven as a cure for whatever. You can't get addicted to it. It only lasts for a couple of days. People find they might study better when they're high. It's legal, so it must be good for you. And it's totally safe to drive stoned. I just drive slower. And so just wanted to kind of challenge some of those thoughts again, and not to sit here and wag our finger, but certainly just to say, there are, just to give people the information to make informed decisions. So one of the things that obviously is kind of at the forefront for us at our clinic is cannabis and psychosis is a very clearly defined pathway there that basically the risk of psychosis and addiction it's linked to THC. And in essence, you're somebody who uses cannabis, particularly if they use at a younger age, or the younger the age, they're double their risk of developing a psychotic disorder later in life. And we do, like I said, that is tied to the amount of THC that people are consuming. So if you look at that actual graph, when you see how much more intense the pot has become over the past few years, that's just increasing that risk. The other thing that we'll kind of mention is that, CBD that people have heard a lot about. And there's a lot of research and stuff going on about CBD, but that is known to be a protective factor against the effects of THC, and specifically with the risk of psychosis. So that one of our things when legalization was first coming out is that we thought there should be kind of a minimum amount of CBD and a maximum amount of THC to try to protect those risk factors. Yeah, and so just to give a sense that when we say dose-response relationships, we're basically saying that the more you smoke or the more cannabis you consume at a younger age, the higher the risk is going to be. So we know for sure that there are kind of certain risk factors that are kind of, excuse me, being identified. For young people at an earlier age. Just some of the quick risks with regards to people who may have already experienced a psychotic episode in the context of cannabis or otherwise, is that if somebody has experienced psychosis, the risk of relapse is greater, the severity of those symptoms can be greater. Oftentimes we find that people who are using cannabis and are also experiencing psychosis regularly, the risk of unemployment or legal involvement is increased, as are those risks of suicides. And those cognitive difficulties that I'll speak a little bit about. So some of the other things that young people might want to consider with cannabis is that there are cognitive impacts that can be experienced by people. So young people who might use regularly, that there are pretty noted effects in terms of their cognition, so their attention, working memory, thinking speed, those sorts of things. And there's also increasing body of evidence to show that it actually can result in structural changes of the brain, so a thinning of the cortex for young people who might smoke pot regularly. And what that means really is that essentially in a lot of ways your brain almost needs to work harder to do the same amount of work, and that some of these impacts can have a pretty lasting impact in terms of graduation rates, in terms of IQ scores, in terms of kind of your cognitive functioning. And again, those impacts seem to be less pronounced for people who are over the age of 25, say, but for young people, teenagers, and people in their early 20s, when the brain is still developing, it seems to have a bigger impact in terms of their cognition. A few other things is just that driving time. It does cause impaired driving. That little graph on the right is really just looking at the amount of deaths post legalization in I think Colorado, that there is a risk associated with driving while high, and that is shown. There is also a risk of addiction. There's often a preconception that cannabis isn't addictive. Now, it's not as addictive as something, say, like of opioids or nicotine, but it still has an addictive quality. And there are a growing body of evidence in terms of some of the other risk factors around risks with other mental health issues, physical health with the lungs, and in terms of how you're using, and certainly there's risks associated if you're using while pregnant. The other thing to kind of throw in there a little bit is that cannabis, we hear a lot about cannabis is good for you, and it has all of these medicinal properties. And it's not to say that there isn't some medicinal properties, but the jury is still out on a lot of it. So there's been, this graph here is really just showing, that there has been an increasing number of authorizations for medicinal cannabis use over the last few years, and that graph's a little bit out of date. But it's not the same as prescribed medication. So there's a whole series of kind of steps that are required for prescribed medication, but this isn't the same thing. Now, again, that's not to say that there aren't some medicinal properties for cannabis, but a lot of it, for the most part, the jury's still out. This is again, it's a few years old now, but a big meta-analysis that was done, which is kind of in the scientific world, is like the biggest thing you can do to kind of consume a whole whack of data from different studies to see how effective something is. And so there's really not a lot of, there are some very kind of established therapeutic uses. So some of the ones might be for dealing with neuropathic pain, or for loss of appetite for people going through chemotherapy. But for a lot of the other things, there's still the jury's still out. There still isn't good sound evidence for it. And I think one of the factors is cannabis is not just one thing. It's any kind of strain of cannabis has between 400 to 500 different elements to it. So it's really hard to be able to kind of tease out exactly what each element is doing in terms of supporting or not supporting a given illness. So the bottom line in terms of cannabis and its medical properties is that there still is a lot to be learned around it. So the quick takeaway here is just, we just want to be mindful when we're talking about cannabis and psychosis. It really is, that formula is pretty simple. It's just the earlier the use, the heavier the use, and the greater the risk. In particular for young people, that's something that we just want people to take home, again, to make informed decisions about their use. David, over to you. We can't hear you, David.
Sorry about that. Technical difficulties, of course. My name is David, and I am the addiction specialist for the Cleghorn team. I'd like to thank Elias and Brian for asking me to tag along. So I'm just going to touch on some harm reduction for today. I would say a big part of my job with the Cleghorn team is what I do is I help bring about change from a quote-unquote unhealthy behavior to a healthy behavior. And I know within my life, when bringing about difficult changes, an abstinence-based type way of thinking can sometimes lead to a bit of failure. And what I mean by that is, someone once explained to me, if you were to take all of Hamilton, all of the people that use substances in Hamilton, and say, okay, I want you guys to never use drugs or alcohol again, they explained to me that the success rate would not be so high. So what I kind of have garnered from that is harm reduction is certainly the best choice. And a big part of that is really meeting people where they're at. The beautiful part about my job is that the part that I value the most is the fact that I can create relationships with people. And I think when I create that therapeutic rapport, a trust is being built. And I know that if I was to sit someone down in my office and I was to condemn them for smoking pot and explain that they're going to be sick and that they're going to end up in a hospital, I know that I wouldn't really get very far. And so the engagement piece is very, very important to me and very helpful in the relationship. I know that keeping a non-judgmental, culturally and ethically sensitive attitude only promotes wellness. And so I really like to understand kind of where people are coming from. And part of my practice is I don't even really bring up the substance use in the first or even second session that we have. It's more so kind of getting to know the person, getting to know where they're coming from, and really understanding what cannabis is doing for their life, what benefit it is providing in their life. Because I know that often people use, for a myriad of reasons we know, but often it is used as sometimes a crutch in one's life, and it is helping them get through something that they otherwise cannot get through. And so I know that if someone was to come along and say, well, cannabis is really helping me out right now, and if I was to just kind of kick that away from them, that wouldn't foster progress. So there are lots of approaches that I take. One is that I do discuss the relationship between THC and psychosis. The great thing about the legalization is that we're getting all the research that we once never had. And so there is research to indicate that lower strains of THC and higher strains of CBD can be beneficial in terms of mitigating negative side effects of psychosis. So I'm always trying to provide as much education as possible. What I do is I help provide evidence, and I like to work with individuals. We literally go online and we do our research together, and I try to keep the information that I give them to be as transparent as possible. And I believe that kind of helps, again, build that relationship. So there are some recommendations that we suggest for ways to use. So one is that remember that every form of cannabis poses risks to youth. The only way to completely avoid these risks is by choosing not to use cannabis. If you decide to use cannabis, follow the recommendations to lower the risks to your health. We know that the earlier in life that you begin using cannabis, the higher your risk for serious health problems. Teenagers, and particularly those younger than 16, should delay using cannabis for as long as possible. You'll lower your risk of cannabis-related health problems if you choose to start using later in life. We know that higher strength or more powerful cannabis products are worse for your health. If you use products with high THC content, which is the main mind-altering ingredient in cannabis, you're most likely to develop severe problems such as dependence or mental health problems. CBD or the other cannabis ingredient can counteract some of these psychoactive effects. Do not use synthetic cannabis products. Compared with natural products, most synthetic cannabis products are stronger and more dangerous. K2 and spice are examples of synthetic cannabis products. Using these can lead to severe health problems such as seizures, irregular heartbeat, hallucinations, and rare cases death. We'll find that in convenience stores there are these substances being sold. Some of it's called spice. There's another one for the life of I can't remember. Salvia. I always urge people to not purchase cannabis from convenience stores. There's zero regulation. We do not know what's in it. It can be very dangerous. We know that smoking cannabis, for example, smoking a joint, is the most harmful way of using cannabis because it can directly affect your lungs. There are safer non-smoking options like vaping or taking edibles that are better for your lungs. Keep in mind that all these alternatives aren't risk-free either, though. If you choose to smoke cannabis, avoid inhaling deeply or holding your breath. These practices increase the amount of toxins absorbed by your lungs and the rest of your body and can lead to lung problems. The more frequently you use cannabis, the more likely you are to develop health problems, especially if you use on a daily or near daily basis. Limit your cannabis use to occasional use at the most, such as using once a week or on weekends. This is a good way to reduce your health risks. Cannabis does in fact impair your ability to drive a car or to operate other heavy machinery. please do not engage in these activities after using cannabis. These effects typically last 6 hours, and it could be longer depending on the person and the product used. Using cannabis and alcohol together further increase your impairment, so please avoid combining driving when using. Some people are more likely to develop problems from cannabis use, specifically people with a personal or family history of psychosis or substance use problems. And pregnant women should not use cannabis at all. And lastly here, avoid combining any of the risky behaviors described above. The more risks you take, the greater chances of harming your health. The greater the chances of harming your health as a result of cannabis use. Back to you, Elias, I believe. Oh, sorry. I've got a few resources to refer to here as well. One that we use a lot at Cleghorn is mycannabisiq.ca. It's good for young people, families, care providers. We have epiccanada.ca, cannabisandspsychosis.ca, drugfreekidscanada.org, and there's a great McMaster research one. It's called cannabisresearch.mcmaster.ca. Thanks.
If I can just add that cannabis, the last one that David mentioned is a research-based thing. Again, looking at the evidence when we're talking about there's still a lot to learn about cannabis. That McMaster, the Cannabis Research Institute, really is looking at that scientific evidence from a real kind of evidence-based lens. So.
And just to talk a bit about cannabisandspsychosis.ca. I'm actually part of the Youth Advisory Council for that, and it's a resource that talks about cannabis and psychosis that's actually youth-driven, and like all the information on the site was either like written by youth and like audited by a scientific committee, or interviews led by youth with people with lived experience of psychosis and experts in the field, and it's a really good resource. And to end us off, we'll go with the second part of my story, which is a bit more hopeful. So after I was put into the hospital and told that I'd experienced psychosis, it took me a long time to kind of process what that meant. And a big part of that process was figuring out who I was now that I had an episode of psychosis, figuring out if I was the same person who I could be, and if there was like any hope left in my life because of it. Especially since there aren't very many role models that we talk about who talk about psychosis in their lives. In the end, I was connected with an EPI team, so an early psychosis intervention team, one very similar to what Cleghorn is, and they really helped me to kind of piece my life back together and figure out what parts were working, what parts weren't, and really create an identity of a person who may have gone through something that was life-changing, but in the end could be used to kind of fuel my future pursuits. A lot of that was being able to connect with people and being able to talk about my cannabis use and talk about my experiences and figure out, like David was talking about, like what it was doing for me and how it was playing a role in my life that was taking over other things, and being able to integrate different coping strategies, different reactions to emotions, and actually feeling those emotions when sober. And in the end, after I kind of wrangled my substance use a little bit and figured out how to reintroduce those protective factors that I'd lost so early on, I ended up going back to school and having a positive outcome. And now I'm working to use my experiences to walk alongside other people on their journeys to help them figure out their lives in the midst of substance use, cannabis use, and psychosis. So I think that's everything we have for you today, and I want to thank you on behalf of us here at Cleghorn for taking the time to watch, and hopefully you learned something. And we're having a Q&A on June 15th, and if you have any questions, pop on by and we'll try and answer as a whole team anything that you have in mind.